like Sally and... Perfect, okay. Good evening, bonsoir. My name is Hélène Giroux, and I'm the director of the Wakefield Writers Festival. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Thank you very, very much for being with us. On behalf of the festival, we welcome guests on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We recognize their strength and wisdom, their stewardship of the land and water, of the plants and animals. Let us each strengthen how we learn about and with Indigenous peoples, with respectful thanks, advocacy, and action towards reparation and reconciliation. Tonight, we're privileged to welcome two powerful and remarkable writers, activists, and advocates for the arts, Sally Armstrong and Robert Thomson, with host Adrian Harewood. Thank you so much for being with us. We're delighted to have you. Thank you. And we're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and we're really happy about that. We have a wonderful festival team. Our theme, as you may know by now, is the joy, the power of story. In the face of the challenges that our world is facing right now, our guests have been, since Wednesday evening, have been exploring ways to find joy, to stay grounded, to nurture hope, and to live with what we hope is compassionate conviction. Tonight, Sally and Robert will explore tales of bravery and resilience and showcasing how individuals and societies face universal challenges with unwavering hope and courage. We wouldn't be able to offer our festival without the steadfast and loyal support of our many funders and sponsors, the Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, the English Language Arts Network, la MRC des Collines de l'Outaouais, Culture Outaouais, et la Municipalité de La Page, who have been with us since our very beginning. As well, our thanks to all of our local sponsors and supporters. As you can see, there are many, and we're very grateful and appreciative of their support year after year. Tonight, yes. And there are some special people that I want to highlight tonight who's made this festival, this year's festival, possible. Al Connors, who is doing our live stream production, and he's already posted the 3 first events on YouTube, if you are interested in going to see it. Greg Brown, the best sound guy around. John Schmidt for digital marketing. Elise Marlene, who's done our beautiful graphic design. Francisca Hines, our photographer, who takes all the photos for the festival. Lucy Sholey, who is on social media. Pamela Scobie, our volunteer coordinator, and all of our exceptional volunteers. The Biblio Wakefield Library. Centre Wakefield La Pêche, which is where we are, with Laura Burks and the Riser crew. And Rod Fotheringham and Greg Stone are great musicians who are out front and greeted you in the foyer. Also, Jim Sherman from Perfect Books Ottawa. Jim, thank you for being with us. You can clap. A special shout out to Chris Corcoran and Peter Gillies. They were the festival co-founders 10 years ago, and it was a joy to work with them over the last 9 years, bringing Writers' Fete to light. So thank you, Chris and Peter. Thank you. And finally, but last but not least, my extraordinary colleagues this year and festival co-organizers, Roberta Lloyd and Amy Carver, without whom this year would not have been possible. Thank you, Amy and Roberta. It's now my pleasure to introduce Adrian Harewood, our host for this evening. Adrian has graciously hosted festival events for several years now, and we're always so appreciative when he comes back. Thank you. Adrian is Associate Professor of Journalism at Carleton University. He was former host of CBC's Ottawa All in a Day and anchor of CBC Ottawa News at 6. In 2020, Adrian won the Canadian Screen Award for Best Local Anchor. He has been guest host of national CBC programs, including The Current, As It Happens, The House, and Counterspin, and many more. He created Carleton Journalism School's first ever course focused on race, a graduate seminar called Journalism, Race, and Diversity. He also created the first course in Canada devoted to the study of the history of Black Canadian journalism. He teaches the video journalism course and the fourth-year course, Journalism Now and Next, at Carleton University. Adrian, it's a pleasure this evening to welcome you back to Writers' Fete. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen, for that very generous introduction. I've been very fortunate over the course of my life to have older folks give me the gift of their stories. When I was a teenager, I used to spend a lot of time in Antigua, which is where my mom is from, and my grandfather, Earl Piggott, told me the story of his life. In my 20s, when I was working at a place called CKUT, Radio McGill, I used to be the manager of that radio station. And a woman by the name of Irene Kahn came into my life. Irene was in her late 80s at the time. She was the daughter of Russian immigrants. Her father had committed class suicide because he was actually an aristocrat. But when he came to Canada, he kind of engaged with working people. He was a friend of J.S. Wordsworth. Irene was friends with Norman Bethune. Norman Bethune was a friend of Irene's. Irene knew Paul Robeson as well. In the 1960s, Irene was someone who housed a lot of draft dodgers from the United States. She was a remarkable person. And she was kind of like a grandmother, a mother to me and a friend of mine by the name of Dave Austin, who's a writer as well. The other person who gave me the gift of his stories was my great uncle, Ralph Budd. Ralph Budd was born in the 1910s in Bronte. Anyone here know where Bronte is? Just outside of Oakville, if you're from the Toronto area? Yeah. Well, that's kind of part of Oakville. But that's where he grew up. He grew up in Bronte. He was an African Canadian who was a real Canadian. My uncle was a real Canadian, like a Canadian, right? My uncle loved hockey, and he loved baseball, and he loved the Legion. He spent a lot of time at the Legion. My great uncle was really the first generation of African Canadians who got a chance to fight in a war for Canada, or at least in one of those two wars in the 20th century. In the Second World War, because, actually, I should amend that. There were black folks who fought in the First World War, but they worked basically in the construction company, right? They weren't able to actually fight. And so my great uncle had a chance to fight. And he was very proud of that. He fought in Italy. He told me a little bit about his time there. He was proud of that because I think it made him feel as if he belonged. Right? Fighting in wars for men has often been about kind of proving your masculinity, right? It's a way in which you kind of show your mettle. It's a way in which you show your fealty to the state, right? It's how you show your kind of loyalty to the state. So for my great uncle, the fact that he was able to represent this country was very, very meaningful to him, because previous generations hadn't been able to represent the country in the way in which he was able to, right? So it was very, very meaningful to him. The problem that my great uncle had was that as much as he loved this country, he didn't feel as if the country loved him back, right? He didn't feel the country loved him back. So when he came back from the war, he didn't feel as if he was accorded the kind of respect that he felt he deserved, right? Given his service to this country. Right? We're going to be talking about war today. We're going to be talking about memory. We're going to be talking about conflict zones. We're going to be talking about a number of things over the next hour and a half, and I'm really so looking forward to chatting with these two extraordinary Canadians. R.H. Thomson is an author, an advocate for the arts, and an actor. I was telling Mr. Thomson, and I'll probably call, I can't call you Robert. You see, I started watching Mr. Thomson as a boy in short pants, right? In the 1970s in Ottawa, growing up in Ottawa, right? So it's such an honor, to be in his presence this evening. But his career on stage, screen, and television has spanned nearly a half-century and garnered him two of Canada's most prestigious honors, the Governor-General's Performing Arts Award for Lifetime Artistic Achievement and the Order of Canada. R.H., yes. R.H. Robert Thomson built the World Remembers, an international commemoration exhibit currently installed at the Canadian War Museum. His latest book, entitled By the Ghostlight, Wars, Memory, and Families, offers a deep dive into the history of his family and its relationship with war. For 5 decades, Sally Armstrong has been one of Canada's most respected journalists, contributing to such publications as Canadian Living, Homemakers, of which she was editor-in-chief, and Maclean's. In addition to her crusading work as a journalist, Sally Armstrong is a human rights activist who has been an unrelenting advocate for the rights of women around the world. In 2002, she was named UNICEF's Special Representative to Afghanistan. She is the author of 4 best-selling books and has traveled the globe covering stories in some of the world's hottest conflict zones. In 2001, she was the scriptwriter for the documentary Falling from the Sky and Daughters of Afghanistan. Her latest book, written with Seema Samar, is a memoir of the famed Afghan physician and activist. It's called Outspoken: My Fight for Freedom and Human Rights in Afghanistan. Please give a warm West Quebec, Wakefield, Quebec, Ontario, welcome to R.H. Thomson and Sally Armstrong. So welcome. Welcome to you both. Thank you. You both have your coffees, which is important. These are both heavy books, and I'm going to start heavy tonight. And I'm going to talk, I want to ask you a little bit about war and your relationship with war. Because Sally, you've had the opportunity to cover wars. You've been in several conflict zones around the world. You know what war smells like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. What do we who have not been in conflict zones not understand about what it means to experience, live through a war like a Seema Samar has?
Well, I guess I need this. Is it on? So when you say, what does it feel like? It feels horrible. War is awful. Nobody wins. Most people lose. Even the so-called winners lose. It is wasteful. It is tragic. And in my opinion, it is enormously preventable. So in 30-plus years of covering wars, I come away with the same conclusion every time, that in my opinion, wars are not about the people. They're about a small collection of greedy men who are seeking power. And the price we pay for that small collection of greedy people is so fantastic that it shocks me time after time after time that we haven't been able to think of a way to stop it.
Does the media get war right?
Well, it depends on whose side you're on. It is so easy to blame the media for everything. It's so easy, especially now, because when you have a person who wants to be the president of the United States saying the media is the enemy, when you have people basically teaching misinformation, it's hard to say who's getting what right. But I think it's a cop-out to say the media doesn't get it right. Our job as media, and we're trained, and if you don't do your job, you know, the first casualty of war is usually the truth. So your job as a reporter is to make darn sure what you get is true. So without the media, who's going to tell the world what is going on? Or you're going to have to wait for Robert's book to tell you what the consequences really were. The media's job is to say this is what happened, not to take sides, but to say this is what happened. And I think by and large, the media that we know to be professional media do that. But with social media, with cable media, this is altering what we know.
Mm-hmm. Robert Thomson, you grew up in the 1950s. And you grew up having a relationship with war. How would you describe your conception of war as a kid in the 50s? How would you describe
my conception of war in the 50s, my father fought in World War II and returned legions of stories of great uncles who fought in World War I, 760 letters from 5 brothers who fought in World War I. Robert was called Bobby then. Bobby, you got to read the letters. Bobby got to read the letters. So it was full of the family. It was where I try to get to in the book in my totally inept way is the story that one rode on, because stories are almost more important than facts. The stories that I rode on were that we were on the winning side. Canada had twice helped defeat democracy, defeat tyranny and bad people. We were good people, they were bad people, and we must celebrate who we are, the empire we fought for, England, and all the heroes. And that was the story cake that I believed in. And there's a lot of truth in the story, but it's a story cake. And so the question is, as you start to grow up, you start to what is the cake and what is the truth? What is the story? And you realize the stories that are being spun to maintain this idea. And once, because I'm an iconoclast, once you start to take apart those stories, either by seeing Oh, What a Lovely War, or by seeing Dr. Strangelove in a high school assembly, or have a teacher take you aside and say, excuse me, do you know what really happened? When the overarching cake stories start to be taken apart, then you actually maybe begin to see what happened. And so it's trying to re-understand, well, what actually did happen? Should we do it again? Who are we that we did this? Who are that we were part of killing whatever World War I, 9.5 million people, and killing 45 million people in World War II, and dropping 2 nuclear devices on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even though the first device dropped on Hiroshima, the American planners said, you know, maybe the first bomb, we should drop it in the ocean to show them what we have before we decide to kill 110,000 people. The decision was made by the American planners not to do a test run to show them, but to kill them. So in there, sorry, I'm on a soapbox, I should get off. It's in there that it's all about trying to refresh, re-examine, re-strip, and see what stories are actually there and what part I am complicit in or not. In Sally is saying, why does this always keep happening? Always. Sorry, that's a soapbox.
I like it.
You stress in your book, in your book, you talk about the fact that, you know, your life has been on stage and in front of cameras, but you say that your industry gets war wrong. There's something missing with the way in which your industry deals with war. What's the problem?
I'm in the storytelling arts. I'm not a historian. I've not been to war zones. I've never been in the military. So I have no right to talk about history and wars or whatever. But I do have a right to talk about how my industry/art talks about war. I have a right to talk about that. And I said to my agent eventually at a certain point, I said, like, I don't mind, I will do mediocre scripts, I will do bad scripts, I will do boring scripts, I will do good scripts, I will not do toxic scripts. And at a certain point as a storyteller saying, I'm not going to do toxic anymore. What's toxic? The Marvel Comic Universe movies. I mean, let's get clear, right? These are, the industry is pumping out films that are cost $200 million to make, and the story of the film is the way you achieve peace is to kill other people. So if you make a popular entertainment diet of the way to achieve peace or bring justice is to oppress, corral, or kill other people, you are, through your storytelling, perpetuating the virus that creates the war. So me, I look at and there's very simple reasons for this. I mean, it makes money. We talked about media selling bad news makes money. Marvel Comic Universe set out not to make great movies, not to tell great stories. It set out to make money. Come on, let's be clear. So my industry has a lot of responsibility in the war-making apparatus to keep it going. Some of us inside it go, no, don't want to be part of it, don't want to be part of it. But the first step is to recognize it. That's the first step. Then to understand it. And then, as Sally was saying, how do we stop this?
Mm-hmm. Sally, you alluded to the fact that it's men who tend to fuel war and engineer wars. My mom, who I wish had been here tonight, my mom's name is Hyacinth Harewood. She's a teacher. She's a brilliant writer. She's probably the most brilliant person I know is my mom. And she's very wise. And my mom has always said that if men understood how much is invested in every single life to bring a person to 10 years or 20 years or my 53 years, maybe they wouldn't engage in war. Right? That somehow men don't seem to fully appreciate all that's required to produce one single human being. How do you relate to that, Sally?
Well, this is not exactly related, but I cannot resist responding with a story. Because you're right, it takes something to understand the making of a human being. Do you remember, I think it was 3 years ago, that little craft called Perseverance landed on Mars. Do you remember that? So, I mean, that's something. Didn't we grow up thinking about little red men from Mars and all of that? So imagine they were going to land a craft on Mars. It took years to make it. It took 7 months from launch for it to land. And then during the landing, and it was being landed by an astronaut who was a woman, they broadcast the landing around the world, around the whole world. CBC, everybody had it. And she kept referring to this as the landing of terror. And toward the end, as it landed, she said, this has been 7 minutes of terror. And Perseverance landed on Mars, accomplished what they set out to do. So when she was being interviewed afterwards, the media were saying, my God, this is incredible. This is science. This is history. This is unknown. This is magnificent. It's the start of a new age. To what can, I mean, 7 months to get there and 7 minutes of terror to land it. To what can you liken this? And she said, childbirth. And I was in my kitchen and I started cheering. I thought, we won. Finally, we won. But to come back to your point, I don't think that war is created because men don't understand the value of a child, because they hope the child is a boy in many of these places, and they need that boy to help them to do what they're doing. I think it is about greed. I think it's entirely about greed. That if I do this, I can have all of that land, and everyone has to do what I say. Now, that's a huge oversimplification, but I don't know of a war that I have covered, and I've covered a lot of them, that could not be proven.
When you tell your stories, you're telling that story through a particular lens, and that lens, of course, is informed by who you are, your experience, your positionality, right? Like where you exist kind of in this society. You talk about this, Robert, but part of the problem is how we talk about war, and a lot of the stories that are often missing from wars. The stories of women are often missing from the way in which we tell war. What's your assessment of how we tell stories about war and the folks that are absent?
Well, I think the way we tell stories about war has changed enormously, certainly in my time as being a journalist. I was covering Sarajevo in 1993. My story was the effect of war on children. But the day before I was to leave, I started to hear rumors about rape camps. And as I said, one of the first casualties of war is usually the truth. And this was before Darfur, it was before Rwanda. Who could believe that they were rounding up the mothers, the wives, the daughters, the sisters of the so-called enemy and putting them in camps and raping them, sometimes to death? So I thought, it can't be true. But all day long, I kept hearing it from more and more credible people. And by the end of the day, I knew there was a story there, but it wasn't my story. And I was in the magazine business, so I could race this international headline story to press in maybe 3 months. So I gathered everything I could, names, anecdotes, everything I could get my hands on. And I came back to Canada the next day, and I gave it to a very large news agency. And I said, give this to one of your reporters. This is an extraordinary story. He said, thanks. And I waited and waited and waited, and 7 weeks later, it was Newsweek magazine came out with a 4-line blurb, they're raping women in the Balkans. So I called the guy I gave the data to. I never suggested it would be my story, because how could I get an international headline to press and wait 3 months? I called him, I said, what happened? He said, oh, you know, it was a good story, and I was going to assign it, but you know, I got busy, and you know, I was on deadline, you know, I forgot. I said, 20,000 women were gang raped, some of them 8 years old, some of them 80 years old, and you forgot. He said, oh, Sally, you're always going on and on about the women. So I told my editorial staff at a meeting that afternoon, and they said, we should do it. I said, we can't. Our lead time is 3 months. And they said to me, don't you get it? Everyone's in Sarajevo. BBC is there, the New York Times is there, the Guardian, everybody's in Sarajevo. Nobody wants it because it's about women. So 2 days later, I was on a plane. I got the story. I'm ashamed of the accolades and the awards I won for that story, because I won on the backs of women who were brave enough to say what happened. And from that day to this, everyone tells the stories about the women now. I'd be in a long line, at the end of a long line, trying to get that story today. So that's positive. People are telling the stories of women.
You know, although, Robert, in your book, you write, quote, I knew of no war memorial that depicted mothers holding dead sons.
Yeah, statuary, imagery, stories. The statuary that was put up after World War I and World War II, they're all stories. They're film sets. They're to arrange your thoughts and your responses. Most of them are noble. And that's a whole other evening about what statuary you put up after wars. But as far as I knew, there were no statues to women holding the bodies of their dead sons. Why? Because, well, we don't want to tell that story. Why also? Because women are not that important. B, and all the reasons why war is important to the people who make it. There is a statue by Kathy Kollwitz called the Pieta, and it's in the it's in Berlin. And Kathy Kollwitz said okay. So Kathy was I will inch back a little, because the perspective I tried to bring to it is, yes, I grew up in 1957 in Richmond Hill, and yes, I had a very cake story version of the war. And yes, in following the story of my 8 great uncles, 7 of whom were killed in the war, how do I actually find out about that war? My conversations then took me to Belgrade, to Bratislava, to Brussels, to London, to Paris, to Moscow. They took me to all these countries, and in trying to build the project to say, you have to actually, don't remember the flag, don't remember the battle, don't remember the politics, don't remember the armaments, don't remember the people. Because that's what we leave out of Remembrance Day every day, every year. We don't remember the people. We remember THEM, but I have yet to find a way that THEM equals people. So until you actually remember the people, i.e. you name them, you're not actually remembering the war. So the project called The World Remembers then took me to Belgrade to talk to the Serbs, took me to Bratislava to talk to the Slovaks, took me to Budapest to talk to the Hungarians, and your story horizon begins to, I cannot say this in front of you who've been to these places and heard those story horizons, but your story horizon starts to expand vastly. And you realize the story cake they grew up with is a tiny, tiny, tiny part of the universe. And that you have to start to see that story horizon of all peoples in all wars. Then you talk about the statuary. Then you talk about what's left behind. Then you talk about why do we always have these, you know, they're wonderful and they're glorious and they're honorable, but they're all kind of like Murphy's production that opened in 1921 and it's still playing in 2025, and you go, well, this production actually should be refreshed. It's 100 years old, which I'm talking about Remembrance Day. And so the statuary in that is deeply absent and inadequate for the stories that we talk about how we actually bring an end to it. And into that is, why are there no statues in Canada of the mother who lost the son? 0. Answer that question and maybe we'll unlock but there's a very famous statue called the Pieta, and it's a mother with a grieving child, with her dead child over her laps. There's 2 copies of it made. The Germans put one in a large cemetery in Russia, where they're both Russian and German soldiers killed, and the others in Berlin. When they placed it in Berlin, because Kathy Kolowitz was a very left-wing artist, people hated her, she was reactionary, well, one of those people, one of those artists. When finally people understood that in the 70s and 80s what a remarkable woman she was, they made this version, they put it in Berlin, and beneath her feet they put 2 unknown bodies. Sorry.
That photo's in your book, isn't it?
The photo's in the book.
Spectacular.
The bodies beneath her feet are an unknown German soldier and an unknown victim of the concentration camps. That's who's beneath her feet. That is statuary. That's art. That's history. That's where we have to go if we're going to stop this shit. Sorry.
You know, Robert, one of the mothers who didn't just lose one son, but who lost 2 sons, was your great-grandmother, Mary Elizabeth. Tell us about her.
One wonders about women. I'm not a woman. I don't have that experience. I have to be very careful. But we tell the story of the men, and the war stories of war ride on the stories of men. Small tangent. The Marvel Comic Universe, I'll do the story of Wonder Woman. Everyone cheers. Oh, it's a woman in the leading role, and oh, she stops World War I. Well, guess what? It's just a man dressed up in a woman's uniform, and it's the same old nonsense story being told again. Sorry, I just had to do that diverse. So what about the women? And one wonders about the mothers. One wonders about the mothers, as you said, your mother said, you know how much work it takes to create a human life? So what did you ask, and the stories in this audience are legion, and you have them. They're in your family, and you've heard them, and maybe given the color of our hair, We have to remember these stories and pass them down to the next generations, other the stories will be lost. And the stories of how did the women bear it. And this was my great-grandmother, who I knew very little of. She was a dignified lady. She died in, I think, 1931. She had 11 children. She had 5 sons, went over to the war. 2 were killed there. 2 died afterwards in sanatoriums from what the war did to their lungs. And 1 survived. I knew him as an old man. And they left behind 760 letters. The question is, what did she feel as she watched the war walk through her children, so to speak? So part of the book is to try to understand that space. I'm not a woman, I have been in a war. But in the book, I say I'm actually, because I'm a storyteller, I can't actually speak for my relatives. I can't speak for Mary Elizabeth. But I can have them in the wings of the theater. So I'm the kind of person who'll say that if we are remembering people now, you remembered your mother, I'm remembering Mary Elizabeth, you're remembering the person in Afghanistan, they're actually present here in some marginal way. As if you are thinking of your relatives and things that are important in your family, they too, are present here. Maybe just in our memories, but I think they're present in more. And in the book, I try to say, I'm telling these stories. I tell you about my family, about George and Art and Jack and Mary Elizabeth, and they're in the wings of the theater, and they come on, and in the book, I invite them on stage. I don't have the right to talk to them, to talk for them, but I can invite them on the stage to speak. So I do bring them onto stage. Some of my relatives said, I said, if so many relatives, I said, you can't come on, we'll be here for the Encyclopedia Britannia. And some relatives forced their way on stage. And Isabel, she forced her way on stage. She said, you're not going to leave me out. So in it's trying to breathe the life into those memories, that in the book I tried to find a structure, meaning the presentation structure, to allow them to speak for themselves and not have Robert put stuff in their mouths. So yes, she lost 4 children. I don't know how she got through it. I have very few letters. Of the 760 letters, very few are from her, but she did spend 8 months in England in 1917 because more of her sons were fighting in Europe than they were at home, and the letters she sent back from there were kept. And I read them. I just did a production of Waiting for Godot. I'm going to do a production of something else. I read texts really, really carefully, because as an actor, you look at the syntax. You look at the language, trying to hear what's beneath. And so I read my great-grandmother's letters like an actor trying to hear the subcurrents of what's beneath this woman who was watching the war walk through her family. And to this day, I do not know. Only the odd phrase would slip out. She wrote home saying to her sister, saying, word has come back from the nurses that 1 million extra beds are to be got ready in England for the big push in the spring. I thought, okay. So I'm a mother. I have 5 sons in the war, and the word is there's going to be 1 million extra beds prepared. Where does that put her blood? So I had to be very careful, but that's the land I try to get into in the book.
Mm-hmm. Someone who has watched war go through her family is this woman, Seema Samar. A remarkable physician, activist, someone who has created hospitals and clinics and schools. I think some, dozens of schools she's built. Like it's a remarkable story. You're writing Outspoken: My Fight for Freedom and Human Rights in Afghanistan with Seema Samar. Can you just tell us about how the two of you, first of all, met?
Oh, that's a good story. When someone called me to say, have you ever heard of the Taliban? I said, no. He said, well, the Taliban just took over Afghanistan, and this is a story you ought to be doing. So, to tell you the truth, I wasn't exactly sure of the geography of Afghanistan at the time, and I'd never heard of the Taliban. But I did hear there was one woman who was fighting against the Taliban, and she was refusing to close her schools as they demanded. She was refusing to give up treating women medically as they demanded. I'm a journalist. That's the story I wanted. So I started to try to find her. And I have lots of connections. I'm sure you do too. I called everybody. I couldn't get the name of this person. So finally I called a woman called Farida Shahid in Lahore, Pakistan. She runs a fantastic activist organization called Shirkat Gah. And she said, oh yeah, I know her, but I can't give you her name, they'll kill her. I said, really? But this is the story. She said, you come on over here and we'll talk about it. Come on over here to Lahore, Pakistan. I was the editor of Homemakers magazine. I had a budget that big. But I went. And all day long, she kept telling me the ABCs of militant fundamentalism. I thought, if you don't give me the name of this woman, my publisher is going to fire me. I've flown all the way across the world, all day talking. But I was learning a lot about how the Taliban had hijacked their own religion for political opportunism and how they were using the women to shut down society. And 5 o'clock was approaching, and I was really worried. And she said, she was closing up her office, and she said, there's a flight tomorrow morning to Kuwait. It leaves at 9 o'clock. You should be on it. Someone will meet you in the arrivals lounge. So I thought, I'm up to here with the budget. I'll go up to here with the budget. So I bought a ticket on the flight to Kuwait, and I walked into the arrivals lounge, and a woman was walking toward me, reaching out her hand to shake hands and smiling. And she said, you must be Sally. I'm Seema Samar. I think you've been looking for me. And that's how I met her. And that was, I've been following her ever since. Yeah.
Where does she get the determination from? I guess I want to find out a little bit more about who she is and how she became the person that she is. She grew up in a time of relative freedom in Afghanistan, when she was growing up. She grew up at a time where she was able to attend high school. She was able to get a high-quality education. She had a father who supported his daughter and wanted his daughter to realize her full potential. Tell us a little bit more about how Seema Samar became this internationally renowned physician and activist. Where did she come from?
I think the first really interesting answer to that is, where do these people come from? How come the Seema Samars blossom in places where you can't imagine a flower growing? And her life wasn't as easy as I did describe all those things, but her father had 2 wives. She knew as a little girl this wasn't suitable. Whether it was right or wrong, she wasn't judging because it's the way all of her relatives lived. But her mother and the first wife stayed in the same bedroom, and the father slept with this one this night and that one the other night. She knew as a 7-year-old that that couldn't be okay for her mother. She was the 3rd child of the first mother. And her father did let her go to school, but he also said he'd kill her if she didn't marry the man that, well, she was taking care of the child of this person. So it wasn't as simple as that. She dodged a lot of bullets along the way. And she learned early that the rules as they were not fair for all of the people. And not just fair for men rather than women, but she's Hazara, and she knew they were persecuted miserably, horrifically throughout history.
It's an ethnic minority within Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The Hazaras are a community, yeah, right. Yeah.
So she saw this, but I think your question is so valid, because why do these people turn up? And we know throughout history they turn up here and there. Joan of Arc, whoever, they turn up and they rebel against the current status, and they ask for change. And that's what Seema did her whole life. Now, she met people along the way who encouraged her, but mostly she met status quo that said, don't do that, you're a girl. The girls weren't allowed to ride bikes. The girls weren't allowed to go out to play, even though they were allowed to go to school. But she would steal her brother's bike, and she'd go and ride around to see what was such a big deal about riding a bike, and she liked it, so she did it a lot. She climbed trees, but she was punished. But she kept at it. And then as she became political, she began to understand how things work against you, and that in working against you, they're really working against everybody.
I want you to elaborate on that a bit, because one thing that I find fascinating about Seema Samar is she doesn't come from money, really. She doesn't come from a family which necessarily had a lot of power in the society. But she's been able to navigate these spaces in ways that are really quite remarkable. Mm-hmm. You know, she's been able to attract all kinds of resources to the various initiatives that she has supported. What are the qualities that she has that have allowed her to achieve so much, particularly with regard to, you know, being able to build dozens of schools and building, who builds 4 hospitals anywhere, right?
I'm going to jump in here with a question alongside your question. Where did the ideas in her head about justice, inequality, and what should be available for women, where did those ideas come from?
She learned to read. It's as simple as that. And you can take that argument anywhere in the world today. And as we know, we're surrounded by conflict today. When people learn to read, they find out what other people think, and then they learn to think for themselves.
She loved Maxime Gorky. She loved Mother. She loved Les Miserables by Victor Hugo.
She was. But you know what else? I mean, I think Seema Samar, for whatever reason, she has a lot of nerve. She's a nervy broad. And I remember one time we were in the Central Highlands in Joggery, where she had a hospital, and the Taliban had stolen her generator. She was so angry, I would be too, wouldn't you? I mean, you can operate, you can do a lot, but you can't run a hospital without some form of power. And they'd stolen it. So she was just enraged, and she said, come on, we'll go out. She had clinics all around the area. She said, we'll go and see my clinic. So we're in one of the clinics, and a Taliban commander comes bashing into the, have you ever noticed bad people make noise? They make noise. They do. In movies, we even make more noise to show how bad they are. So this guy comes in, and he's pushing an old lady in front of him. She was probably younger than me. But he's pushing this woman in front of himself, and he bashes through the door, and he says to Seema, she's sick, fix her. So Seema examines the lady. She determines she has tonsillitis, and she needs an antibiotic. But to the Taliban commander, she says, you're going to have to leave her with me overnight. You come back tomorrow. So off he goes, bashing out the other way. Seema puts I keep saying the old lady, she's probably younger than me, puts her to bed, makes her a cup of tea, starts a course of antibiotics, and sits and chats with her. And the next day, when the Taliban commander, he was a big shot, when he came back, Seema said to him, you and I have to talk. You've got my generator. As it turns out, I've got your mother. And I thought, we're both going to be shot right here. They made a trade. So she's very nervy, but she knows how to win until this round. But yeah, she knows right. And if you know right, I think you can move with it.
Someone I think who knew right in your book, Robert, is really one of the heroes of the book, I think, and one of your personal heroes, and that's Maiden. Who is Maiden, and what did she mean to you?
Maiden was my favorite great aunt. Maiden was never married. We visited Maiden's apartment, had tea and lemon cake, which she made. Maiden taught me how to make bread. Anyway, she was one of those Maiden aunts. And behind the story of the woman who never married, or the woman who was always charming and wonderful to all her, was the fact that she lost 4 brothers in a war. So I try to go, where is Maiden? How did she live through that? There she is, she's 16 years old, she's at school in Toronto, and her 5 brothers are over there. 1 brother is killed, another brother is killed. What's happening in the little sister's mind? Then 2 more brothers come back. They have lung things. She visits them in the sanatorium. Another 10 years. What's happening in her mind and imagination about this? And then her surviving brother comes back. Tiny little hints come out in that we're driving past a church in Toronto. she's old at this point, and she's allowing me use her car, and so I'm driving her. And we drive by this church, and she said, I haven't stepped in that church since 1916. And this is a nice older woman, a very gentle woman, of that mythology. She says, I haven't stepped in that church since 1916. And even though I was young and stupid at driving, I asked why. She said, because that's where my brothers were blessed before they were sent to the war. And it's in that crack, that fissure, that you begin to sense the irate young woman in there. She then undertook the task because she was the family story keeper, and many of you out there are your family story keepers.
She was the glue in the family.
She was the glue. So she was the one who, her mother had a stroke, 2 brothers were dead, 2 brothers were dying in a sanatorium, who just sort of kept the family going. And she undertook the task to type out the 760 letters. It took her years. She got very tired doing it. She was like, I don't want to say pissed off. Great aunts like mine aren't pissed off, but she was pissed off. And it took her years, and she carbon copied them. But she was perpetuating a story about her family that we didn't really give that much credence to then. Oh, yeah, the letters, you got to read the letters. Oh, my God, I don't want to read the letters. They're all so boring. They're all talking about cake. They're all talking about send me. But they're not really about war. She perpetuated that story. So I wondered about her typing out all these letters and then collating them in the books. And so, in fact, she was creating the story of the family, which is then perpetuated, and she has kept her brothers alive in a way. And I do want to add, because again, I'm not a historian, I'm not a history person, don't know a lot about the armed forces, but I do know about stories. That she was a story keeper and a story maker, as I hope many of you are. And when you get to war, you must understand, I believe there's 3 kinds of stories told about war. And when we talk about how do we stop this, it might be useful to think of the war stories in this context. There are 3 types of stories told about war. The stories told before a war, and be aware and notice them. They're usually the warmonger stories. They're usually the stories that prepare you to fight. Prepare the people to pay their tax dollars. Prepare the armaments factory to go and build more tanks. They are the preparatory stories, and you are being prepped. Why it is important, why those people are very, very bad, why that totalitarian dictator is going to take over the world. They are preparing you for war. It may be a good war, it may be a terrible war, but be aware that you are being prepared. They are now, the stories go when people said, well, Canada isn't spending 2% of its GDP on NATO. And another general will stand up and say, yeah, we're only at 1.4%. We got to hit 1.2. We're not going to look good in the international world. That's a war preparation story. It's prepping you for war. He may be right. We're not spending enough of armaments, but it's a pre-war story. Notice it. The second level of stories are those told during a war, and they are very complex and messy, and we're in the middle of it right now. We're in the middle of war stories about Gaza now. We're in the war stories about Ukraine now. There's no ending, there's no purpose. Everyone telling the story about Gaza and Israel or northern Lebanon, and everyone telling the story about Ukraine is trying to put a template on it. The Ukrainians are plucky and they're going to win. No, the Russians are going to defeat them in 3 days. Because the stories have no shape. And as a species, we hate stories that don't have a shape, a purpose, and an ending. But the stories told during a war are in this moral mess and uncertain period. Be aware of those people who tell those stories, whether in the press or whether they're the general, because they're trying to manipulate you one way or the other. And my great-uncle's letters were interesting because they were the stories told during the war. So be aware of those stories and watch how they move. Everyone's dying to put an end on the Ukraine story, which is an absolute nightmare, let alone Gaza, that we cannot see an end to that. Let's not go there. The third level of stories is more important, or the most important at all. They are the stories told after war. The stories told after war, I suggest, are more important than the fighting. Because what is told after the war will determine if you are going to fight another one. After the war, everyone gets busy telling the story after the war. Look out. And I'm not saying value judge them, I'm saying be aware of them, of the structure of the stories being put to you. We tell the stories about war after war in Afghanistan. So those who tell the stories after war have a huge, monumental responsibility. If you just take the Vietnam War sorry, I'll get off this in a second. If you take the Vietnam War for an instant, the Vietnam War was a mess. Killed over 1 million Vietnamese, I don't know, 54,000 Americans. Awful, 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 awful war. America had the bravery in the movie industry in the years after the war to tell Deer Hunter, to tell Apocalypse Now, to tell Coming Home. These were really difficult and eyes wide open stories about the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Then they stood that for about 6 to 7 years, and then they backed off, and Sylvester Stallone appeared, and Chuck Norris appeared. And they started telling the after-Vietnam War stories in a very different way that put America back on top. Sylvester Stallone's going to North Vietnam to rescue Americans who were in prison. But the point of this, you watch the culture struggling, what stories do we tell after war? And the Chuck Norris and the Sylvester Stallone stories only perpetuate conflict as a mean of bringing justice and peace. Whereas the stories that Hollywood was brave enough to tell at the beginning, Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, Coming Home, were brave enough to say, no, you can't do that anymore. So there were 3 layers of stories told after war. Sorry, we started on Maiden, here I am. But Maiden was helping write those stories. And I am totally grateful to her. And she's a hero of mine. She taught me how to bake bread.
The story of Afghanistan between 2002 and 2021 could be described as a story of possibility, right? That was a period of transformation. You know, during that period, Seema Samar assumed some senior positions in her country. She was part of the cabinet. You know, she headed the Women's Affairs Ministry. She saw Afghan women graduating from schools at levels that had never been seen before, changing their lives. And then 2021 comes, and it goes to pot. Like it blows up. It goes backwards. And women are no longer able to do those things that she wanted them to do. How is Seema Samar dealing with what Afghanistan has become, given all that she gave to try to change the conditions in which women would exist in that country?
Well, she's dealing with it the way you would. She was heartbroken. She was devastated. She's still upset. She's not crying as much now. Now she's moved into activist mode. But you know, we need to remember, a lot of people refer to the 20 years we were there as a failure. In that 20-year period, life expectancy in Afghanistan went from 47 years to 63 years. That's not a failure, it's a miracle. I mean, maternal mortality dropped by 50%. 39% of all the kids went back to school. 39% of them girls right at the get-go. And nation building began. So it really was a remarkable period of growth. But as the book explains, from the get-go, there were enormous problems.
What were some of them?
Well, I'll tell you, and we describe those. You know, even at the beginning, and one of the interviews I did with Seema, she said, we're being pushed to create a presidency. This country does not, it's a tribal country, said it doesn't suit a presidency. We need a parliamentary democracy. But what happens, at least in every war that I've covered, the Americans bring the most money and the most people, and therefore they get to make most of the decisions. And they decided it would be a presidency. And if you look from the very beginning, when the Afghans come together, they have what they call a loya jirga, and all the people come in to the same tent to discuss what's wrong. But at the loya jirga, the very first one, after they got rid of the Taliban and were declared their own country again, it was agreed by those who were reshaping Afghanistan that they would not hold people responsible for what had happened in the country. And again, I'm sure all the journalists were writing about it. I most certainly was. And SEMA kept calling for accountability for the warlords, for the mujahideen, for the people who had committed hideous crimes, crimes against humanity. But it kept being not sidelined, simply not dealt with. So the problems began at the get-go, and they grew behind the scenes, for people knew the corruption was out of control. People were writing about that. People, they had ghost schools. All that money being sent over to open a school, and the school didn't exist. They had ghost soldiers. We were saying this, but at the same time we were celebrating the fact that women were graduating from law school and that the country was more prosperous than it had ever been before. I mean, the resources in Afghanistan, you wait and see. The Chinese will be the next to be running Afghanistan. It has tremendous possibilities, but it cannot pull itself together, and tribal countries are very hard that way, to have enough unity to say, we're under one flag and we're going to do it this way, not that way.
Sina Samar, though, also blames, well, she blames three forces, right? She talks about the Mujahideen. She talks about Saudi Arabia being a problem for Afghanistan. She also says the United States is a huge problem for Afghanistan.
You know, I'm going to tell you something. When we were writing this book, Seema knew what happened at the end. She knew who was betrayed. She knew what Trump had, the deal he'd made. Most journalists knew it too. But I said to Seema, we cannot print one thing in this book that we cannot prove. We can't go by hearsay. We have to have absolute proof, because if we have one thing wrong, they'll come after us and say the rest of it's wrong too.
What was the deal that Trump made?
It's in the book. I'll describe it in a minute. But I needed to be sure. And you know what? I called the State Department and I said, could I have a report on what happened? And they gave it to me. See, that's what democracy does. So it's the Secretary General's something or other thing of Afghanistan is what it's called, SIGAR, S-I-G-A-R, so I probably said that wrong. And they published what they did. And Trump made a deal with the Taliban. But then it gets worse, because they provided funding for the Taliban to basically disarm the National Army. The National Army, they stopped paying them. So these soldiers were out on patrol or on the job and not being paid and having no backup and no health support. So their wounded were not, it was a recipe for disaster, but the recipe was put together by government. It's disgusting, is what it is, but almost everything about war is disgusting.
Robert, you had the opportunity, as you mentioned, to travel. You've been to Belgrade for your project. You've been to Budapest. You also went to Moscow. Spent time in Russia. One person that you had a conversation with was Russia's ambassador to Canada, Georgy Mammadov. Mammadov. Is that better? Mammadov. And he told you, and it was quite an eye-opening experience for you with him. And he told you that you have a Protestant approach, or rather, your approach to history betrays your Protestantism. What do you think he meant by that?
very simple. Pews very straight up, all straight lines. Very complex. No, I'm sorry, I'm being facetious. It's all, thank you for the question. It's all growing out of the story cake of my youth, right? Stories were good, history was good, Canada was good. It was kind of a cake. And that's not even looking at our First Nations populations. That's not even looking at our history of slavery. That's not even looking at patriarchs and all the rest of it. We had a very simple version of history. And like any onion, it takes a long time to chip and crack away at it and crack away at it. And Moscow was important to me because I had the idea that on the centenary of the Great World War, of the First World War, what should you do? You should actually remember those who were killed in it, which means name them, which means 9.5 million names from over 30 countries. Why not do that on the 100th anniversary of a war? Stupid idea, crazy idea, totally not possible, but Robert decided he would try. So Robert decided he would try. My wife's in the front row. She knows how crazy I am. But you had to try. You had to do something. I named the 68,000 Canadians. We had named that. We projected it on the National War Memorial. We projected it in Canada House in London. We knew the power of naming. We knew the power that when a name appears, when Martin Conboy and myself who did these projects, when a name stands for more than 15 seconds, it begins to morph into a person. If a name stands on a wall for 5 seconds, it's information. But if it rests long enough, a transition is made and something is there, a bit like my relatives being in the wings of this room here. And so we projected the 68,000 names, and we timed each name. We projected on the National War Memorial, and we put on the website that people could see the exact moment that their relative's name would appear. So people would turn up at the National War Memorial at 4:04 a.m. in the morning. Why? Because they knew, they'd been told that at 4:05 a.m. their grandfather's name would be there. And that combination of the symbol of the war, the National War Memorial, whatever you think of it, saying to the whole country at 4:10 a.m., your grandfather will be here. And having the name appear was very, very powerful and pushed remembrance past THEM, past, this is something we do honorably every year, it pushed it past that into the area of the personal, the powerfully personal. So having done that for Canada, I then said, well, because we're German Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians, French Canadians, Slovenian Canadians, Italian Canadians, South African Canadians, why isn't everybody there? That you must, if you're going to remember a war, you must name them all. So I set out to talk to France, to talk to Germany, to talk to Italy. Yes, Don Quixote going at windmills. But it was the French ambassador, who I had to get France on board, of course, because they were major. They said, Robert, you don't have a project without the Russians. Why? I said, Robert, they lost more than anybody else. Hands up, who knows that? Nobody knows that. The Russians lost more soldiers in World War I than anyone else. And yet we don't put it in the story. That's another problem we have here. So why not go to Moscow? Everyone said, no, it's impossible. History is complex. They do not exist. No one cares. These names were before the revolution. The revolution was a disaster. Everything is destroyed. Robert, you'll never find them. So it became one of those games. But it was vis-a-vis the cake history of the world that I grew up with, of trying to see the infinite complexities that you saw in Afghanistan, the infinite complexities of how histories are played and replayed and not played or played indirectly. If we are going to escape the virus of war, we must embrace all those incredibly complex histories and begin to breathe them in before we can make any rational decision about whether to have another war. So Moscow was very much in that, so to speak. And I ended up in a rundown house on the outskirts of Moscow because everyone said, no, there's no names. They are destroyed in 1921. They're gone. All of that was happening. The military didn't know. And finally, I was taken to a small house in the outskirts of Moscow, which looked like a decayed mansion from a Dostoevsky novel, and there were two guys in blue overalls who I thought were the janitors. They were, in fact, the archivists, and they took us upstairs in a freezing building which was falling apart with the wires down the wall. And finally, they were distrusting us because we are Westerners. West and East still exist in very definite ways. And finally, when they began to understand that it was the people that we were interested in, not the politics, not the nationalisms, not the militaries, not the campaigns, not the medals, not the statuary. We were interested in the people. So one guy, Yevgeny, went back and he pulled out and he said, Robert, I have 2,000 of these books. And it was a book with handwritten names because the Tsar had said to each regiment, you must write down the names of the dead at the end of every day. The Tsar had said that. Otherwise, the armies don't care. There was no microfilm. There was no photocopy. There was no photographs of these 2,000 books in which there were over 1 million names. So these names of 1 million, and there are probably 1.8 million Russians killed, sit there dormant and forgotten in this cold house on the outskirts of Moscow because no one fucking cared. And that is one of the barriers that I feel impulsed to break through, that you must care. I don't care if they were Russian or Slovenian. I don't care if they're from Gaza or Tel Aviv. You must care. And the World Remember said, you know what? We're going to name them, and we're going to name them. I don't care what your gender is. I don't care what your rank is. I don't care what your medals are. I don't care what your skin color is. I don't care what your religion is. And I don't care what your nation is, because those are secondary to the human part, the people who lose. So the world remembers, names all these people without making those distinctions. They are equal in memory. And when we see the dead from Gaza and the dead from Israel as equals, then maybe we will not have so much impetus to keep going. But we cannot see them as equals. We must divide them. Something strange in human nature says, no, one side or the other. Choose a side. If you don't choose a side, I'm sorry, I'm on a soapbox. I should get off this. But this was Moscow. So,
you know this?
I will go one step further. It intrigues me, and I have no answer to this. Why are we driven to take sides? We're driven to take sides. It must be in the DNA. Who has not taken a side on Gaza, Israel? You feel, you're compelled. No, both sides. Inevitably, you take one side or the other. There was a divorce in my family, too many years ago. And of course, we sided with my sister. Of course he was bad. Of course she's good. Of course he was the transgressor. Years later, you went, no. That highway ran both ways. But at the moment of pain, at the moment of anguish, you chose a side. So in Gaza or Ukraine, in the moment of anguish, you choose a side. What is that? Why do we do that? And that is emotion over ration. And if you don't choose a side, you get into trouble. If you stand in the middle saying there's importance of Israel, the importance of the Palestinians, you are shot at from both sides. You are seen as weak. You are seen as someone who betrays somebody. If you stand in the middle and say the pain of that mother's loss over her child and the pain of that mother's loss over the child are equal, you are accused of betraying someone. Why? Why do we do that? And so I ask you, as you feel yourself polarized, as these are the middle stories told about Gaza, as they are continuing now, and we hear the news, but we're at 42,000 now. We're not even talking about those in South Lebanon. We're 42,000 in Gaza. You feel pushed to one side or the other. I have to take a side. I hear this bit of news. I'm not saying don't do anything different. I'm saying observe yourself being compelled to one side or the other, and ask yourself, what is compelling me? Because if we can understand what is compelling me, choose him over her. What compels me to do that? That, I believe, is part of the toxic wind which keeps the wars going.
Well, I think this encounter, this exchange has been powerfully personal and compelling. So, Sally Armstrong R.H. Thomson, thanks so much. Thank you. This is just the first half. So we're going to be going to a break. You had some cake this first half. There's more cake to eat in the second half. So we're going to take a short break, I think about 10 or 15 minutes. And then when we come back, you can pose some of your own questions and make some of your own comments. So we'll see you in 15 minutes? 15 minutes. And we're going to be signing books afterwards. Yes? Yes. Okay. So we'll take a break right now. This is probably never, it's probably never happened to Mr. Thomson, Robert, but when you do television for a number of years, I've found people are always disappointed when they meet you. Because, you know, and it never failed. People always say, I thought you were taller. Anyway, so my apologies. My apologies. Yeah, happens every time. Okay, I think we're ready to resume, and we're very fortunate that both Sally and Robert have agreed to read from their books, and so they'll read some passages, and I might ask one or two questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to pose some questions and make some comments. So, Sally, would you like to?
Do you want me to read from there or here?
Wherever you're comfortable.
Go read from there.
Okay.
That's okay with you. I have to use Robert's glasses because I forgot mine. That's how I got to make friends with a movie star. Okay. It began as a sparkling May morning on an otherwise ordinary day. The weather was perfect, sunny, warm, with a light breeze blowing springtime into Kabul. The blossoms had drifted off the trees, making way for leaves to burst out onto the branches. It was approaching the end of Ramadan, the holy ritual that requires prayers and fasting for 30 days. So the anticipation of Eid, the celebration that marks the end of fasting, was on everyone's mind. Families and friends would gather to pray and give thanks and to savor traditional foods like steaming platters of Kabuli pulao. For a country that had experienced so much bloodshed and so many setbacks, this rebirth season of spring could have been seen as a sign of deliverance. But on that day, May 8th, 2021, at 4:27 p.m., when the first explosion tore into Syed al-Shuhada School in Dashti Barki neighborhood in West Kabul, where members of the Hazara ethnic minority live, my hopes for the future were dashed, and my heart broke again. Although I could not have predicted at the time that this, in fact, was the beginning of the end of the Afghanistan I had helped to rebuild. The events of May 8th, the who, the why, and the what, go a long way to describing the wrongs that need to be righted if my country is to see a new beginning. The warning that day came by way of a beeping from my cell phone. I was in the midst of a meeting at Gaurshad University. By the way, one of the major funders of Gaurshad University is here tonight. Hallie, where are you sitting? Just wonderful work Hallie and her team have done to send these girls to school. And a meeting at Gaurshad where we were discussing a hopeful future, including a new research department and the enhancement of the program for women's empowerment. A horribly familiar chill crept up my spine when I saw the message that flashed on my screen. Explosion, Dashti Barki.
In such a crowded part of the city, I knew there would be bloodshed, and I hoped the casualties would be few and the wounds minor. Still, it was impossible to forget the terrible attacks Dashti Barkey had already experienced at the education center, the sports club, the wedding hall, the maternity hospital, and several mosques. Casualties had been high. The discussion at the table blurred as I kept checking my phone. The second text appeared minutes later with words that struck me like shrapnel: girls, school, death. By now, everyone at the table was staring at their phones. Dashti Barkey, in the district where the Hazaras live, where men work menial jobs as laborers so they can scrape together the funds needed to bring their families from the Central Highlands of Afghanistan, which is the traditional home of the Hazaras, to the city and the promise of education for their children. When the third text hit my screen, it felt as if the story was unraveling, like Afghanistan itself. The first report was that a rocket attack had hit Syed al-Shuhada school. Then a car bomb exploded at the scene as bystanders ran to help. A third and fourth explosion followed, and the casualties mounted. Of course, I wanted to race to the scene. I'm a medical doctor, I'm a mother, but I knew the chaotic traffic and intense security checks in Kabul would hold up the rescue. So I called a halt to the meeting, and I went home, and I turned on the TV. My thoughts were swirling around the events unfolding on the television screen when I glanced out the window and noticed a bird building a nest. I was immediately struck by how carefully the bird was weaving the tiny bits of twigs and dirt and string to build this nest where she would bring new life into the world, and how she was doing so without destroying any part of the environment. I watched that little bird working feverishly to prepare the nest and considered how easily a heavy rain or a fierce wind could destroy it. I remembered a woman from Kandahar coming to me and saying, "What have I done wrong in my life? 3 times I built a nest, and storms came and destroyed my nest, but the storms were man-made. So many in my country have suffered because somebody else wanted their land or their lives or to have power over them."
This is from a later part of the book where I actually talk about making my mother's coffin. It is related in that of the many wars that we are fought and we participated, the war against First Nations peoples is one of the big ones. It was a slow motion war, went on for 400 years, and it's still not over. And in my family, there was always talk of First Nations blood, but you never pay attention to it. And we're also talking about the women, and the women who are silent, and the women we don't hear from, and the women who are the victims of war. And we actually commissioned a piece called The Song of the Mothers, was played by the National Arts Centre Orchestra at the National Arts Centre in 2018. And Barbara Siganak, who was an Adawa artist and translator, she translated some of my grandmother's letters, Mary Elizabeth, who we talked about. And I sat on the stage while they were singing this piece, which was in Odawa and English and French and German, about where women put the feelings of war that happens. And when Barbara got to my great-grandmother's words, "Where are my children, vos sind meine Kinder, où sont mes enfants, ainde dash ayewag nedyansag," she said my great-grandmother's words in Odawa. And that started a train of shiftings in me about my mother, on whose side is reported to be First Nations blood. Hearing Mary Elizabeth's, my great-grandmother's, fears about war expressed in Odawa began to shift the shadows that had lain over some of the great-great-great-great-grandmothers on my mother's side of the family. Among the fingerprints most easily erased from the earth are languages. Meteor prints take millennia to weather away, but languages can disappear in a cosmological nanosecond. An impact crater leaves a ring of the meteor's rare metals, melted upon impact, but soon refrozen into an inventory of the celestial traveler's life history. Odawa, like all languages, is an inventory of a people's history. That it is spoken today makes us all richer, and that the language can help to reconcile makes us all wealthier still. When the shadow shifted, it seemed as if one of my great-great-great-great-grandmothers had stirred. I know nothing about her, and yet that has not stopped me from looking for signs. My mother's family tree refers to a Jane French, possibly a Kanawagwe Mohawk. But apart from that, she remains an unknown. If Jane were a Mohawk, I'd like to at least know her indigenous name and imagine a glimpse of how she might have appeared. Just as the Mars rover Perseverance surprised us by recording the faint sounds of the red planet's remaining winds, so histories can be revealed in unexpected ways. My surprise would be glimpsing what I thought was a likeness of the forgotten Indigenous women in the family in my mother's face. She had died from complications after a fall at the cottage. As her children, we wanted to see her to the grave with care. 15 years earlier, we had bought an off-the-shelf casket for my father's body. The wood had looked plastic. The padded velvet interior was inappropriate, and the press metal handles were nothing that my fingers wanted to grip. When carrying a parent for the final time, my sister said to me, "Why don't you make our mother's coffin?" It was a bold idea, risky because of my limited carpentry skills, and I wasn't sure if a do-it-yourself coffins were permitted at funerals. Years before, at my sister's request, I had built a cradle for her baby daughter. Woodworking has always calmed me, whether running my hand along a piece of clean pine or taking in the perfume of fresh-cut hemlock. The music of the trees as wind moves among their needles and leaves also balances me, provided it's not the dark symphony of a malevolent gale. It was not an easy time for the family after my mother's death. Her fall had begun a cascade of medical complications, and eventually she decided to refuse further treatment. She was dead in less than a day. Cicely had been her usual sharp mental self, but late one night she asked the nurses to call the local minister to her hospital bedside, and in the small hours of the morning, a vicar was summoned from his slumbers and jotted down her final wishes, and then soon after sunrise, we were awoken by the call that she was gone. My mother had always been a determined woman. "All right," I said. "I'll build it." The cradle had been built with materials from a lumber yard and plans from a magazine, but the coffin had to be constructed from a design in my head. For decades, the cradle had been passed around our family and has rocked multiple newborns to sleep, including my two sons. The coffin would hold but a single soul, since my mother had wanted to leave in a storm of flames. Cradles embrace, while coffins carry. Both are intended to bring comfort and peace. I wanted my mother's coffin to be truly hers, made only with materials she had known. The boards for the box, the rope for the handles, and the fastener for the lid all had to be from her world. I chose the wood from trees she knew. The maple planks had been cut several years before from cottage trees toppled by a violent storm. A cedar from outside her bedroom window provided the edge trim, and the white pine could be found everywhere on our land by the lake. Constructing it was a solace.
The funeral home in Richmond Hill had already collected the body from the hospital, but I had questions. Were do-it-yourself caskets acceptable? What about the regulations? Do bodies leak? They said not to worry, that as long as what I constructed would fit onto their trolley, my term for the draped cart on which caskets are rolled into churches, the family had decided that we would carry the coffin rather than have it wheeled in by professionals, but would it hold together as we walked up the aisle? No one wanted a Monty Python moment. Once finished, my mother's casket traveled from the cottage to the funeral home on our roof rack, an odd object to lash to a small car on a large highway. Being the ultimate amateur, I saw no need to rent a truck. But I was reassured by my carpentry when everything arrived at the funeral home intact. The home's director declared my work acceptable and asked, "Shall you and I place your mother in it?" He took the head and upper body while I lifted her hips and legs, a light bundle that had given life to 3 children. The last time I'd wrapped my arms around my mother's hips was probably when I ran to embrace her as a child. Her body fit the coffin perfectly, and then, to my surprise, a likening of our forgotten family began to appear. In addition to Jane French, our family tree, cobbled together by generations of relatives, identifies a second Indigenous ancestor, Elizabeth Chouinard, who was Métis. She had married Jane French's son, Peter Dease, a trader with the Hudson's Bay Company. So Cicely's great-great-great-grandmother had been Métis. We know more about Elizabeth Chouinard, the fur trader's wife, since when she and her husband retired with their 5 children to a farm near Montreal, an HBC factor, James Keith, commented that Mr. Dease was governed by his old squaw and sons, she holding the purse strings and they spending the contents par la porte et par les fenêtres. If Elizabeth did indeed hold the purse strings, she was just one of a line of strong women in the family. When you are looking at your parents' coffin, you sometimes see the parts of your life that were determined for you. But I also felt that I was glimpsing 2 women from the shadows of my family. And unwittingly, my brother, sister, and I had contributed some of the signs. Regardless of its appearance, I thought it handsome. The coffin pleased me. I had chosen its elements with the same care as my mother had taken when she dressed me as a child. The pine and maple were from the forest that she'd enjoyed with my father. The headrest was a block of cedar I'd saddled with a chisel so her head wouldn't roll. She was ours, and the coffin was hers. No velvet padding was needed, as if it were a container whose contents might shift during shipping. The white pine sides hugged her shoulders as we lowered her in. My mother was from Vancouver Island, and my brother, who still lives there, arrived with a large section of bark from a Douglas fir. The aroma from its resin was of Cicely's summers as a child. We fixed it to the lid of the coffin, as though it were her coat of arms. I'd chosen 4 brass screws to secure the lid and proposed that each of us drive one in. They were from the sailboat, the dinghy called the At Last, that my father had built and my mother had sailed on. "Woody, you're going to dump us." The boat's remains had been with us for years, and its screws were brass, a nautical must to avoid rust. My father had secured them into his home-built boat, and now his sons and grandsons would secure them into his wife's home-built casket. Rope from another retired sailboat provided handles when looped through the holes in the coffin's side. The aged hemp had been repurposed once before, since I'd run it along the side of the dock for my mother to grasp when entering the lake to swim in her elderly years. In the funeral home's work area, We felt free to talk or improvise with whatever impulse came to us. My mother was in a plain blue dress that my sister had chosen, with her hair brushed back from her forehead. Past rigor, her limbs were loose. After settling her in, her head cradled by the cedar saddle, the funeral director and I crossed her hands on her chest. My brother had also brought sweetgrass from Vancouver Island, and before securing the lid, we arranged the braid of grasses, a symbol of spirituality and peace for many peoples, between her fingers. And there, in her face, was my mother's indigenous family. Her great-great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Chouinard, and her possibly Mohawk great-great-great-great-grandmother, Jane French. I was unprepared for the appearance of a part of her that I had never known. In the parlance of her BC family's British-biased identity, she had the look, a trope inside which nestled the prejudice that had placed the shadow over that part of Cicely's past. Lying there, my mother couldn't help but be everything she was. The sweetgrass rested easily in her hands. A silence was speaking.
Thank you both. Thank you. Sally, I thought I would ask you, you've written this book with Seema, and I wanted to know just how you approached the writing of this book with her. How did you do it?
Well, you know, excuse me, it really was easy because I've been interviewing Seema since 1997. And when she decided she might want to tell the story, and it was a big might, I said to her, until one of you tell the truth of what happened here, nothing's going to change. She said, how would we do it? So basically, we decided together on an outline for the book, and then I interviewed her piece by piece by piece. And that's how we did the book.
Okay. Robert, I was trying to describe to myself what your book is. And I was thinking, is it a memoir? But it felt more like a meditation. That's how I'm choosing to kind of understand it. How do you understand the book that you've written? How would you describe it?
Okay. A little story. I trained to be an actor. I'm sorry, this is related. This is real. I trained to be an actor. You know, I want to be an actor. I want to be an actor. I want to be in plays. Oh my gosh, you're hired. Oh my gosh, I'm at the Centaur Theater. I'm at the Winnipeg, whatever. And I rehearse and I'm with all the older actors and I'm young and I act and I get out there and I learn my lines and I'm good. And then I get hired again. And the play closes. This is a pattern. The play closed and a week went by, a month ago, 2 months go by. And then I would sit up in bed, go, oh, that's what that scene was about. And more than once, I'd be in a play, I would do well or whatever, and then months later I would go, oh, that's what that scene was about. And I became very frustrated. I thought, well, why don't I understand that when we're rehearsing the play and the play? Why does it take years? Well, the book is a way of looking back at the history of my family and myself and of Canada and saying, oh, that's what that was about. In that, what was contained in the wonderful cake of my upbringing and how Canada is a good country and a multicultural country and we're a fair country, which is true and also not true. Later you learn, oh, that's what this country is about. And only when you get to those moments can you truly begin to work on the story. So in a way, the book is trying to say, explore that. I'm sorry, that's my tangential answer to your good question.
Well. Can we go to the audience? Are you ready to go to the audience? Yeah? Okay, so if you have any questions, I'm going to come to you, or comments. Mr. Tanny.
I would just like to ask Sally, where is Seema now?
She's in Boston, and
Does
she
she
was a
live
visiting pardon?
Does she live there?
She's living there now. She came there, actually, Seema came to the U.S. to visit her son and daughter who live in the U.S. in July of, I call it the Ides of August of the year it happened. And as the country began to fall apart, she wanted to rush back to help. But everyone who knows Seema knew that if she did, she'd be dead. So she stayed. And just as an aside, it wasn't hard to get her refugee status, but then they said, well, she has to have a job if she's going to stay in America. So people like Hallie and others got together and got her a job as a visiting professor at Harvard. I mean, isn't that what everybody does? Now she's at Tufts, actually. But, and she's very active with the women's groups that are trying to reverse what is going on in Afghanistan.
And that's Frances Atani, folks. Okay. Whose son is a fine musician, and we went to high school together. I'm the bad person who talked about height. How can you run a society where women don't participate?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. And how long can they keep this up?
Well, they can't. And that's the best thing that we've heard all night. Because if you think you can run a country by silencing the women, first of all, there's something wrong with you. And secondly, Afghanistan is a blueprint for what happens. Your economy goes to hell. Your people are hungry. You have no future. And as it happened, I don't think we had as strong a response as we needed in order to reverse it quickly. Because, you know, the question you asked me earlier about how Trump made the deal and how it happened, the part I didn't tell you is sort of like the story you just told. In reflection, I was thinking, the world was tired of Afghanistan. We'd been there, and in 2014, most of the troops pulled out. We thought we'd done enough, but do you know that the international troops stayed in South Korea for 35 years before they felt they were safe to carry on? So when this happened, I think people were of a mind of, well, there they go again. They're just at it again. Even the UN were talking about, you have to talk to your enemy. You have to bring them into the tent. You can't bring deviants into the tent. Sorry. It's not going to work. And it's taken these few years for people to come around to the fact that you cannot deal with the Taliban. And if you cut a deal with the Taliban, you are cutting a deal with the devil. So it's not going to work for you either. And I believe, here I go, something is going to happen. I think those forces who had to finally come to terms with the fact that the Taliban were not moderate, were not reformed, they are, as I said in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago, sexual deviants. If you say that a woman may not speak, and that's the new rule, she may not speak because she will cause me to rape her voice. There's something wrong with you. So I think more people in a position to make change are coming around to that. But the other really good news to me is that the bad guys are now fighting with each other. I think the Kandahari Taliban and the Kabul Taliban are getting upset with each other. Who's trying to moderate and who's trying to hold the party line? And I think whenever that happens, you find a wedge that you're able to sneak through with the kinds of people who can make change. You cannot run a country by shutting down the women. History will tell you that.
Questions? Yes.
Thank you. This goes back to the first part of your discussion, and you mentioned, Robert, that taking sides is sometimes an element of war. In other words, once you do that, you're starting down a path. And here it goes. A bad question. What would be your suggestion for us to do with Mr. Trump?
Vote him out of office and understand and be compassionate to this strange, mixed-up story that is keeping millions and millions of Americans seeing him as their hero. We must be compassionate and understanding of that story, even though if it's a totally wonky story. To them, it is legitimate. It's based on misinformation, lies, and unreality. If we just say, you're bad, you're stupid, you perpetuate the divisions. Doesn't mean you don't try to keep them out of office. Doesn't mean you don't try to fight the misinformation, fight the lies, fight the J.D. Vances, and fight all of them who are spewing this bullshit. But we must have compassion for what their story is, however twisted it is. And when we dismiss their story, we become like pale versions of the Taliban. We just dismiss people. Nobody is to be dismissed. Not supported, but not dismissed. And that's hard, because then you go, well, I can still feel, I can feel the currents moving in the air. What, you might think there's some legitimacy to the MAGA movement? Right? That's already floating a little bit in the air. No, I don't. But as soon as I don't condemn, I'm open to that. I'm in a vulnerable place, which is why the center is a very difficult place to be compassionate to all. Because you get accused of betraying, you get accused of not understanding, you get the radicals will do it on the outside. With the far, far radical left will accuse the radical left, not the radical left, but just the radical left, of not being left enough, right? And the plane of gaining your identity and strength through accusations and negativities starts to run the playing field. And that's the playing field that we have to stop it some way. So have courage, be fair, stand in the middle. Don't keep them out of office and fight the misinformation, but I wrote my book about narratives, nothing about narrative now. All the narratives are up in the air. The narrative about democracy, the narrative about Western institutions, the narrative about the United Nations, the narrative, let alone the narrative of women. All the narratives are up for grab. How we got to this place? Wow. We're all a little breathless, we can't figure out, but all of them are up for grabs, which is why it's more important that we vote from here. We don't vote from here. Well, we need a change. We just got to get him out. That's voting from here. Vote from here. What are the policies of each of those leaders? Where are they going to go? Make your decision, and don't let this vote. That's populism. That brings authoritarians and dictators in. Sorry, long question, but thank you for the question.
You know, I'd like to add to that, because we had dinner before coming in here tonight, and we were discussing the fact that war goes on, and yet almost all of us know what to do, and we know how to do it, but there are barriers in front of us that stop us. And I think what we need to look at are those barriers. Who stops the peace? Who stops the negotiation? Invariably, we get stopped, but we never seem to talk about those barriers. Just adding.
Good. Okay. Come over here first.
This is a question for Sally, but maybe Adrian, you can weigh in as well. It's a question about the ability of journalists to do their work. I worked in newspapers, magazine, radio all my life, and they're all on the ropes. I worked at the Whig Standard in the 80s. There were 36 full-time journalists, 14 part-time. Now there are 6. So what do you think is the future of journalism? The ability to cover wars, but also city council and school board. Where is the hope?
Which may be even more important than covering war, because you don't know what's going on in your own town, and you don't know why the road isn't getting fixed, then that's a big problem too. I don't have the answer. I'm horrified by what is going on. You know, I was on a huge assignment in Kenya in March, a spectacular story. And it was one of those stories that needed a magazine. It needed lots of pages and lots of photos. And when I looked around, I thought, there isn't a magazine. Maclean's could carry it, but it would be 2 months later and 2 pages. And so I took it to the Globe, which has a huge audience, and they gave it lots of space. But we're losing our ability to tell stories. You need to squish everything down into a shorter narrative. But worse than that, we're losing our ability to talk to each other, as you know better than anybody. If we don't share stories in our newspapers, on the radio, on television, what happens to us? We lose a big piece of who we are. And how do you, I mean, it was obviously social media that started eating up the ad dollars, and a lot of other ills with social media, speaking of misinformation. But the papers that are alive today are being supported by big money. The Thomsons support the Globe. The Hondricks no longer were supporting the Star, and they're somehow clinging on to business. So it's very, very bad news, not only for you and I as writers, but it's bad news for people and citizens. Where's Jimmy Munson? He might have something to say about this. Isn't it so that our ability to share news, whether it's you coming out of China or you and I telling a story out of Canada, it's a loss for people?
I'm going to pitch in here too with this, because it gets, you sail right into the territory of what bills passed through Parliament and who supported them and who was silent, right? Not only the online's harm bill that went through, which of us stood up and supported that, as Trudeau was being kicked in the head over that? What about the bill against the social media companies giving part of their advertising cut to Canadian media? Right? This is the bill passed by the government to try to address the problem of why is money flowing out of traditional press. You can't operate it without money. So there's the Trudeau government. I'm not saying vote Liberal, but you've got to acknowledge what they were trying to do and to say to the social media, say, I'm sorry, some of that money has got to go to traditional media. The Conservatives have attacked it, probably have lied and accused. Which of us stood up and supported the Liberals in that legislation? Nobody. And that's how we just let the problem get deeper. So again, it's because we don't stand up at these kind of moments. Oh, we'll let the Liberals take the flak. Oh, they're all corrupt and been in power too long anyway. It's because we let them take the heat, and none of us stand up and say, no, that bill is appropriate. Right? That money is walking out of the country, and it's walking away from all the print media, print and news organizations. And they should put some of that money back. So we are culpable to a extent of what we don't fight for and when we remain silent.
We're going to be having that conversation. I'm helping to organize a political journalism conference at Carleton. That's happening from November 15th to the 17th, and it's attracting working journalists and academics from across the country. So people like Duncan McHugh will be part of it. People like Tanya Talaga is going to be part of the conversation. Who are some other people? A whole host of Negan Sinclair as well is coming from Winnipeg. Folks from the Tyee. Folks from the Narwhal. So they're going to be a whole host of folks. So I'd invite you to come. Everyone is invited if you'd like to come to Carleton, 15th to the 17th. What I'd also say is there are also a lot of young people who are creating new publications, which are really exciting. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Narwhal, but the Narwhal is a fantastic publication that has been doing some really, really critical work, and I'd encourage you to check that out. There are also publications like The Logic, right, the Tyee. Like there are a lot of new publications that this young generation are initiating, and I think that there's hope. Yeah. Okay, I thought I saw right here. Okay. I'm sorry.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentations tonight. I used to work in this business of journalism at one time. Adrian talks about being short. Well, I tell you, people looked at me and said, you were much taller on television. However, I've been looking at this picture or painting above you tonight, and that has given me great inspiration of seeing the fertile nature of books and feeding who we are tonight. And you both have been feeding us incredible information of your lives. Robert, personally, which I've been touched by. Sally, you've been a dear friend for a long time and touched by all of your stories. You've enthralled us tonight. Where will you inspire us next? What's coming up for the two of you in terms of new publications? Because we need more Thomsons, we need more Armstrongs. Thank you.
I'm working on The World Remembers, and I meet the Serbs on Monday to try to bring them in. There's 4 more countries, blah, 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 blah. I have to finish The World Remembers, and I may take another year, but 10 years, but I'll be dead by then. But we're working on a new show about Robert Burns. We're hoping it becomes a touring show. And the point is to say that the passionate poetry that came out of Robert Burns 220 years ago from Ayrshire, Scotland, inspired Frederick Douglass, the incredibly articulate abolitionist, freed slave in the United States, who the first book when he escaped slavery, got to New York, was a book of poetry by Robert Burns. Taras Shevchenko, who was a Ukrainian poet. There is a Burns, we've contracted, there's going to be Ukrainian music because in a school in Ukraine, there's a Burns club. And it's because of the passion and of the self-determinations of peoples. It's Burns' poetry traveling there. Tagore from Bengal, who was a wonderful voice in Bengali and Indian history. And Burns was a big hero for him. So it's to take the poetry of Robert Burns and the music and show how it moved and inspired all these movements, was part of the inspiration of various, I don't want to call them liberation movements, but rights movements around the world. So we're trying to put that together, and maybe it will come to Ottawa, who knows?
I'll come. Whatever. I don't know. Tomorrow, I'm on a plane. I'm going back to my kayak in Bathurst, New Brunswick. After that, I'll decide.
I'd like to address my question to Mr. Thomson, if I may. Do you think there's any, I mean, with the amount of veterans, of course, World War I, World War II veterans, I mean, they're all passed on. And of course, having taken care of the War Memorial for a long time, as I did with Public Works, I'm wondering, Remembrance Day, has it lost its meaning? Because I don't see, I was there the morning Nathan Sherrillo was murdered, and I was there for Remembrance Day 2014. There was 52,000 people there. Now, you know, if it rains on Remembrance Day, well, you're good, mate. See, maybe 10, 12,000. If it's sunny, people open the drapes. It's a bandwagon day. We'll up to the War Memorial. We'll watch Remembrance Day, and then we'll go down to the market for lunch or brunch. I just care if you could comment on that, please.
It's a hard question because you always want to honor and support what the day is about. For some people, and for many people, it means nothing. For me, it's a broad discussion of how it opens out, how it reflects us more as a country, of all the different wars we've been in and all the veterans who've come back from all the wars. And until it does that, I don't see it attracting a wider and wider audience, because those of us who are in contact with the survivors of World War I, we're getting old. And there's fewer, I don't know how many, 300 veterans left from World War II? I mean, it is sunsetting, as it were. So I don't know how to reimagine, but I think it needs to be reimagined and keeping its honor at the center of it, but reimagined to respect all wars and the losses from all wars. I don't know who would do that, because if you touch a national symbol, you usually get your fingers burned.
Mind you, I was asked to speak at a citizenship ceremony once, And there were a collection of people from all over the world that were very excited about becoming Canadians that day. And one of the questions afterwards was, how can I speed up being a Canadian? And I said, look around at the ceremonies we have, and Remembrance Day was coming up. So I explained what it was, and I said there's cenotaphs all over the place, although they are the statues that you say should be replaced with the one that you spoke of in Berlin so poignantly. But I said, go, because that's where the people will gather, and you'll see what's important to the people. And I still think that Remembrance Day does that for us, even though, especially after a conversation like tonight, we worry about who's being remembered and why. But I thought it was a very good thing for new Canadians to do, among other typically like July 1st, or I'm trying to think of celebrations that aren't religious, but things that Canadians will gather for. And I think you feel more part of the country when you can touch that kind of an event.
For me, there's an opportunity. If Eddie, you're not old enough to remember the flag debate. I'm old enough to remember the flag debate. And we remember the awfulness of the flag debate when Canada replaced the national symbol with a new one, and it hurt a lot of people, and it was divisive, but it was needed. And it refreshed and reimagined how we present ourselves as a nation. For me, Remembrance Day needs that kind of debate, however divisive and hurtful it is, because as with the flag, we came out with something that actually carries us much further. And for me, Remembrance Day could be one of those symbols that we work on a serious reimagining of it, not to disrespect anything about it, but to say more, more, more.
I have a question.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead, Sally.
No.
It's a question, hearing you speak, both of you, and my question is directed to you both. How do you keep your hope? How do you keep acting with what we were talking about a little bit earlier with compassionate conviction?
I'll go. You know, I'll tell you a story. This happened in Kandahar, and it happened in January, about 9 months before 9/11 happened. And I was interviewing women who were working in, I'm trying to remember what it was called, anyway, it was an orthopedic hospital, but they had another name for it. And these were women who had been pharmacists and teachers and artists, and they weren't allowed to do any of that, but they were allowed to work here because they were making prosthesis limbs for sometimes polio victims, sometimes people who'd stepped on a landmine, but a lot for people who'd had their limbs chopped off by the Taliban for something like looking the wrong way. And their story was horrific and hard to hear, hard to write. And they had to paint their windows black, not only at work, but at home as well, so no one could see them. They had to wear wedge shoes because the Taliban didn't like the tap, tap, tap of a woman's high heel. Their lives had descended into hell. And you know, when I finished my interview and I turned off my recorder and closed my notebook, our conversation switched. We started, as women do, talking about our kitchens, our kids, our in-laws, our elderly parents. We started kibitzing about the wrongs in our lives. And when I left them, they were stuffing sweet cakes and naan bread into my pockets because they were worried that I might be hungry on the way out of a country that had basically put them in prison. And I get back to see them once the Taliban was gone. That gives me hope. People are people. They're people wherever. Look what happens in this country. I mean, look what happened when Fort McMurray exploded. This whole country turned to help them. Look what happened when, I've just lost his name, the tragically hip, what's his name?
Gord Downie.
Remember that concert he had in Kingston? 12 million Canadians tuned it in. Look what happened when the Humboldt hockey team were killed. The Canadians put the porch light on. They put hockey sticks on their porch. They sent their hearts to Humboldt. This is who we are in this country, and that's who people are in all those other places. They care about each other. They care about their kids. They care about their kitchens. And I get to see that, I think, because I mostly interview women. And mostly when I close my book, the conversation turns to other pieces of our lives, even when they are in such a desperate situation. It gives me a lot of hope.
That's very good. Because I come from the arts, I don't know, I choose something from the arts. But when things like this happen, I get a lift of energy that'll carry me through a decade of despairs. It's called the Messiah Complex. I don't know if any of us saw it. It was against the Grain Opera Company in Toronto, and they're a tiny company, and they decided to do the Messiah, and it was during COVID, and they did it on film. They hired singers from across the country. One was a First Nations singer, one was an Innu singer, one was a Cree singer, one was a white singer. There were kids in Montreal. And each part of the classical piece called the Messiah, Central European, white, old music, which is a fantastic piece of music. They had these different singers. The Cree singer sung her section in Cree. The Innu singer sang her section in her language. They filmed her in the Arctic and the snow singing with the full orchestra, pre-recorded. The film takes you all over Canada, from the Arctic to the Great Lakes, to downtown Montreal, to the prairies. And each of the singers stood in their environment and sang this piece of Bach in their language. It was rivetingly creative and brilliant expression of what we can do, of where we can go. It was so powerful that even the New York Times noticed it and said, this is a remarkable piece. At Christmas, go online and look up the Messiah Complex and just listen to its breadth and its beauty and its promise of what we can do as a nation as we reimagining the stories of who we are, as we are everybody from everywhere. How do you write a story about that, and how do you create a country like that? And that piece of opera spoke directly to the heart of that. That keeps me going.
I think on that inspirational note, I think that's an apt way to end this session. Thank you both. Thank you both for taking us on a journey for the last 2.5 hours. Your books deserve to be read and read and read. R.H. Thomson, Sally Armstrong, thanks so much. Thank you. And both Sally and Robert will be signing books at the back over here. So thanks so much for joining us this evening.
And to you, Adrian, for hosting our evening with such gracious curiosity, with warmth, empathy, and humanity. Thank you so much.